William was an example of somebody who really proved everyone who was discriminatory wrong, because he proved himself to be really the quintessential Australian in so many ways.
Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. As Robert Menzies' life story demonstrates, Australia's egalitarian culture has always facilitated an exceptional degree of social mobility. But while Menzies' journey from the backwater of Japarit to pleading landmark cases before the High Court may have been remarkable, it pales in comparison to that of his friend from the almost as remote Victorian town of Wangaratta. The son of gold rush era migrants from China, William Ah Ket defied discrimination at the height of the White Australia policy to become the first known barrister of Chinese descent in Australian history, and a man whose cases are still cited in legal textbooks today. An optimistic and tireless advocate for his countrymen, who never let the barriers he faced bring him down, Ah Ket's life is a multicultural success story that long predated the very idea of multiculturalism. Now, 150 years after his birth, Ah Ket is finally getting the recognition he deserves as a visionary promoter of bringing East and West together into a cohesive Australian whole. Well, joining me today to discuss the life of William Ah Ket is Professor of Commercial Law at Melbourne Law School and editor of William Ah Ket, His Life and Times, Professor Andrew Godwin. Welcome to Afternoon Light, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Georgina. Great to be here.
It is great to be here, and it's wonderful to finally have you on Afternoon Light, because it was, I think, a number of years ago you came into our museum talking about this man, William Ah Ket, as a friend of Menzies. And I was unfamiliar with the story, really unfamiliar with the import of this person, William Ah Ket. And you were clearly deeply passionate about his story. And it's great that we can now share it with our audience.
Indeed. The first moment I started to research William and read about his story, I became aware of all of the interesting personalities, prominent Australians and everyday Australians with whom he interacted and with whom he dealt. And Robert Menzies was one of them, as you mentioned.
Yeah, well, they shared chambers together, Selborne Chambers.
Indeed. Yeah. And William was senior to Menzies. Menzies, I think, was 16 years younger than William. But he obviously had a great influence on Menzies. In fact, there's evidence to suggest that Menzies modelled his advocacy skills after observing William in court. And so they had a great friendship, as the records indicate. And Menzies thought very highly of William Ah Ket, describing him as one of his great friends. So very interesting to consider the relationship that they would have had and the respect that they would have had for each other.
Now, this is at a time of White Australia policy. So we need to, I think, paint a picture of who William is or was, and also what he looked like, because he's born in 1876 in Wangaratta. But there wouldn't have been too many. Of course, there were Chinese gold rush migrants in and around Victoria at the time, but still, the sight of a Chinese kid, Chinese lawyer, would have been very unusual in that era.
Absolutely. I don't know, indeed, whether there were many, if any, other Chinese families in Wangaratta at the time. Of course, as you mentioned, there were a lot of gold diggers who'd come out from China during the gold rush boom of the 1850s. And indeed, that's what brought his father, Ah Ket, to Victoria to work as a community leader, a head man, who helped the gold diggers, the Chinese workers, with their affairs, whether it be keeping track of the money that they've earned through digging for gold, or whether it be helping them to write letters home, or helping them to deal with various challenges that arose with the law, and also interpreting for them. So his father, Ah Ket, really was a great community leader and provided a great service to the Chinese community back then. But yes, they would have been very novel, I think. And to some extent, Georgina, I think the novelty worked in William's favour, because it was very much, although there was concern at the time about the influx of Chinese and the so-called yellow peril, nonetheless, William really was such a loner in his profession. In fact, depending on how you date the commencement of the Victorian bar, whether it's 1839 or 1841. William was the first non-European barrister at the Victorian bar for its first 120-year history, would you believe?
It's amazing.
It's quite remarkable.
Yeah, that really is remarkable. William's father comes to Victoria in the gold rush, but it doesn't sound like, was he a gold seeker himself, or was he sort of going to be part of, I guess, the Chinese community that would facilitate their success? It sounds like he was attached to them rather than seeking the gold.
Yes, he had been educated in his hometown of Toylaan in Guangdong province, and he'd been educated to the level that a minor official in China would be educated. And for whatever reason, and it's not clear, he decided to come out and join his fellow countrymen on the Victorian goldfields. He moved around a little bit, spent time in and around Bright, Wangaratta, of course, and acted, as I mentioned, as a community leader, an agent for the Chinese workers. He did a lot of other work as well. After the initial 10 years of the gold boom, he settled down in Wangaratta, married a Chinese wife who had also come from that region in southern China, and that's when they really commenced their family, took up accommodation on a property outside Wangaratta where he first established a market garden, and then that turned into growing crops. I think he grew tobacco for some time, and then ended up opening a market like a grocery, a mixed goods store for the Chinese workers, and did so well and became so prosperous that he purchased property in the town in Wangaratta, and ultimately ended up living in a terraced house on one of the main streets in Wangaratta, Faithful Street. And that's where he remained until he died in 1896 when William was 20. He died, interestingly, just a few months after his wife had passed away. And so the expectation is that he had a broken heart, as it were.
Aww.
But it must have been difficult for William at the time because he was only 20, had already moved to Melbourne to commence his legal studies, to find himself bereft of his parents. He did have his 5, 6 sisters. He was one of 8 children, the only boy, so he was very special for that reason. 2 of his sisters didn't make it beyond childhood, but his remaining 5 sisters were all very close to him. And as you would expect, they all went on to have families, and their descendants are still around today.
They're probably around Victoria.
Indeed.
May have bumped into them
still
without
in
knowing.
northeastern Victoria, Melbourne.
So I'm interested, Andrew, before we get on to William himself, I've been to Bendigo, in a gold rush town, of course, and there's a Chinese sort of historical museum and a temple and things like that. So you really feel the influence of Chinese gold rush migrants. I have been to Wangaratta, but I can't picture any sort of strong sense of the Chinese gold rush heritage there. Was it unusual to choose Wangaratta, do you think?
It probably was. And how that turned out, I'm not too sure. But as you say, it's not one of the towns that you'd put on the top of the list of towns in which the Chinese settled.
No.
Bendigo, Ballarat would be much better known in that regard. But no, William did his schooling in Wangaratta until the age of 17 in 1893 when he moved to Melbourne to commence his studies at Melbourne University.
It's interesting reading about William's education. So he has a Wangaratta High School education, so an Australian education. But his father and mother are obviously very keen that he has a sense of his Chinese culture, language and identity. I mean, his mother had come from a very traditional background in China. She had bound feet.
Indeed.
We forget about the bound feet.
Absolutely.
Oh, how she got around on the market gardens.
She got around in many respects on the back of men because she just couldn't walk long distances. So that must have been an oddity at the time, of course, but according to the information that's available, she was held in high regard. It must have been a somewhat lonely existence for her because she didn't speak much English.
Right.
So I don't know to what extent she felt part of the community, but she produced 8 children, one of whom was William Ah Ket, and that's a significant achievement.
Yeah, notwithstanding the bound feet.
That's right.
So William leaves Wangaratta to go to the University of Melbourne, and he's obviously completely fluent in English and in Chinese. So what sort of sense do you get of how he's presenting himself at Melbourne University?
As you mentioned, he was a very outstanding student. He'd done very well at primary and secondary school, well enough to matriculate into a Bachelor of Arts at Melbourne University. He was also schooled in Chinese classics, so they had a Chinese tutor in the family when he was growing up. And so he would have learnt Chinese and spoken Chinese at home with his father and mother, although one suspects it was more likely to be the local dialect, Cantonese, than Mandarin. But of course, most of the workers from China had come from southern China and did speak Cantonese. But even so, a lot of them spoke different dialects. And so it must have been quite challenging, the communication aspect. But in the archives, there's a copy of the Confucian classics in which William has inscribed various notes and also written Chinese characters. And
But his notes are in English, are they?
His notes are in English, but he practices Chinese calligraphy.
Right.
And I was quite reassured in some ways that his Chinese characters, the way in which he wrote them, were no more convincing than the way in which I write my Chinese characters.
Okay.
So, but he wrote a phrase in the book, the English of which is, "True friends are more valuable than gold." So there are a few insights into what William would have considered to be important.
Yes.
Principles, important concepts to hold dear to himself as he grew up in what was quite an interesting environment.
So he comes to Melbourne University. He's a brilliant student. He is very keen on cricket, isn't he?
Yes.
I mean, I've got here that he's served as scorekeeper for the Supreme Court cricket match in 1904, and he's obviously popular with the other law students, because he's elected president of the Law Student Society in 1907.
Yes.
So the fact that he looks Chinese, both parents are Chinese, but he speaks Aussie English, is obviously completely fluent.
Yes, doesn't appear to have held him back.
So how does that happen? In 1901, we have the Immigration Restriction Act passed, the first act of the new Parliament of Australia. This is a country that is committed to white Australia, and yet an ethnically Chinese student can be president of the Law Student Society 6 years after the Immigration Restriction Act, the White Australia policy, is legislated.
It is remarkable when you think about the times in which
But are we
lived.
sold a pup? I mean, when we're
I
told
think we are
about, Australia's a racist country and, we have white Australia and it's abhorrent and how could we do that? And then you read experiences like William Ah Ket's. It's hard to marry those two descriptions.
Except to the extent that William proved himself to be an Australian in all senses, whether it be sports. He loved the racing, horse racing. Yeah. He was assimilated, integrated. He obviously had to be strategic about how he pursued his career. So he knew the parameters within which he had to operate. And he obviously did so very successfully, very skillfully, navigating his way through personal and professional circles. But you're right, it's quite remarkable that he managed to achieve so much given the times. How did he manage to do so? I think it was, as I said, he proved himself to be every bit as Australian as the rest of us. In fact, in many respects, more so. So he was great with English literature. He would quote Shakespeare. He'd quote Gilbert and Sullivan as well, and Robbie Burns
and
in
Scottish
the course.
literature, yes.
Scottish literature, indeed. Yeah. So he married a Scottish wife, or a wife of Scottish background. And that was challenging initially because he met Gertrude, who was to become his wife, I think in 1906, but didn't end up marrying her until 1912. And there was a secret courtship that went on for about 4 years before he plucked up the courage to ask her father for her hand in marriage. And when he did ask her father said no.
Oh.
He wasn't going to have his daughter marry an Oriental. But Gertrude at the time was working with an insurance company called Mercantile Mutual, of which the chief executive was somebody called Sir Oliver King, quite a mover and shaker. And Sir Oliver knew Gertrude's father. And when Oliver heard indirectly that Gertrude wasn't able to pursue the love of her life and that it was William Ah Ket who proposed, he called Gertrude into his office. And initially she didn't know why she'd been called into his office. He said, "Gertrude, I'd like to help you with your relationship with William. Would you let me speak to your father?" And Gertrude said yes. And so Sir Oliver rolls up to the Bullock residence and meets with Gertrude's father and says, "William is a fine young man. We brief him in matters that we have before the courts. And your daughter couldn't marry a finer Australian."
Wow.
And so with that, of course, her father relented and the rest is history.
Yeah.
But it's an example of how even on the personal side of things, it must have been difficult. What's interesting though, and I've mentioned this before, the extent to which William played up the similarities and downplayed the differences. Because in those days, it really was very much a matter of proving that you were the same as everyone else, even though you looked different from most others. And so he was very, I think, successful in proving to everyone that he was every bit as Australian as they were.
Yeah.
And I think Menzies saw that.
And hence the love of cricket and
cricket,
English literature.
Horse racing.
Yes,
He liked to punt on the horses.
Yes.
And
so sort of almost more Aussie than the Aussies.
Indeed.
We know that Menzies and William Ah Ket met at Selborne Chambers, but when I was looking at the marriage between William and Gertrude, I saw that they were married at the Kew Methodist Church. And I wondered if maybe, of course Menzies identifies as a Presbyterian, but his mother was Methodist and they were Kew people. So I wonder if they actually met before, or sort of
it's
socially in those areas.
Very good question. He had, I think, met Gertrude at that church in Kew, and he wasn't a regular churchgoer to my knowledge. He subsequently became more active in the Freemasonry movement. But so according to Toylaan, his daughter, he met Gertrude at a function at the church, and the moment he saw her, he said, "That's the girl for me." And that's the girl he ended up marrying. And so, yes, it would be interesting to consider what contact he'd had with Menzies initially.
When he goes to the bar, he obviously needs to get briefs. Did he experience much discrimination, do you think?
He seems to have hit the ground running, actually.
Right.
He did his articles at a firm called Maddock and Jamieson, now Maddox.
Oh, yeah.
And so he got a good start there. And I think everyone was so impressed with the work he'd done during his articles before he became admitted as a solicitor, that when he went on to read with, his name was Stuart MacArthur, a experienced barrister, and after he signed the roll, the briefs followed from firms like Maddock and Jamieson and other firms, many of which I think had some involvement in public interest cases.
Right.
And so were very willing to refer public interest cases to William. But there's no indication at all that he was held back when he first went to the bar. In fact, he was involved in a couple of very prominent cases in his early days, 1904, 1905. And in one of those cases, he appeared as junior in the High Court. So he, as I said, hit the ground running, and I think was given a head start because of the record he'd left at the law firm where he'd done his training, and because of the esteem in which he was held generally. So, yes, it's remarkable, as I said, when you contemplate that he was the only non-European barrister and must have been a little bit of a novelty in that regard.
Menzies does recall, I think in his memoirs, A Measure of the Years, a certain prejudice among clients against having a Chinese barrister to an extent limited his practice, though instructing solicitors thought very well of him. So that he was, perhaps the clients themselves thought,
well, that's right, they may
maybe
have been
not,
a bit
but the instructing solicitors
reticent
said,
or a bit hesitant.
Yeah.
But the instructing solicitors would have said, you can't do better than William. And he had a very broad practice that involved commercial law, some insolvency-related matters, even family law. But I mentioned that he had been involved in public interest cases, one of which is Potter and Minahan. which made its way to the High Court and involved a man called Minahan, James Minahan, who interestingly was born in the same year as William in 1876, of a Chinese father and a European mother. And at the age of 5, he went back with his father to China, where he lived for the next 20 years and didn't end up speaking much English, as you'd expect. When he came back on the boat and wanted to be admitted to Australia, they assumed that he was an immigrant, administered the notorious dictation test.
Yes, which he duly failed.
Because he said flat out, I can't understand English, let alone write down the 50 words that you were about to dictate to me. And so William took on that case and argued it, and the upshot was that the court agreed that because he'd been born in the colony of Victoria, which was a British dominion, he was a British subject, and the Immigration Restriction Act wasn't designed to prevent British subjects from coming back to the place where they'd been born. And so William was successful in that case. That would be one of many public interest cases in which William had got involved.
He does, I guess, get a reputation for these public interest cases and becomes a Chinese community leader himself. Do you think that was because it was, where he was sort of most recognised, I guess, as having value, or I mean, was it because of his ethnicity? Do you think that he fell into the public interest
combination
disputes,
of factors,
or was it just he felt passionate about those things?
Combination of all of that. So he did feel very strongly about achieving equal treatment for his fellow Chinese citizens and Chinese Australians. There would have been a few expectations on him in the Chinese community to step in and help out because he was the only Chinese barrister at the bar. So there must have been a bit of pressure in that regard. But he had such a diverse practice and had such a well-rounded practice too, if you consider all of the matters in which he got involved. I think the public interest cases were cases in which he felt he had something to give and he felt obligated as a member of the Chinese community. But also, as you mentioned, Georgina, he felt very passionate about the discriminatory legislation, the prejudice that existed at the time, and the extent to which even those who'd become naturalised British subjects in the colony, was then the colony of Victoria, were not given the same treatment as other British subjects. So all of those things, I think, motivated him. Deep down, I think he was very much an advocate for the disadvantaged. And I think that was partly motivated by his own roots. He knew the hardship that his parents had endured. He knew the hardship that many of the workers on the goldfields had endured. And he wanted to do something about that. In fact, his father, I love telling the story, his father, according to Toylaan, had suggested to him when he was a kid that because he'd got some experience helping his father with the work that he did and doing some interpreting, he said, when you grow up, you'll have enough experience and expertise to work as an interpreter. To which William replied, better than that, I'll do law. So I think from a very early age, William must have had a commitment towards achieving justice.
Yeah, that's fascinating. He did actually organise protest, didn't he, against the Immigration Restriction Act in 1901. Obviously, it was unsuccessful.
Yes. It wasn't so much a protest in the street, as it were. It was more submissions to Parliament, memorials, if you like, letters. He wrote a pamphlet railing against the factories and shops legislation, which prohibited the Chinese from working outside the restricted hours. I think it was 9 to 5 or thereabouts.
Yes, there was some legislation, wasn't there, to favour European workers in factories and obviously disfavour Chinese workers in factories. So he was very activated on those issues.
Particularly in the laundry trade and the furniture trade, where the Chinese did very well. But nonetheless, it was alleged that they were operating in an uncompetitive, unfair manner. And William pointed out in that pamphlet that I mentioned that they were no different from the Europeans. They were criticised for being more thrifty They were criticised for
being more efficient.
Being more efficient. They
more
were
productive.
criticised for being abstemious because they didn't spend so much money on alcohol.
Right.
And for those reasons, they were seen to have an unfair advantage, you see.
Yeah.
William pointed out they're no more abstemious than the Europeans. They might drink less wine, but surely that's something that we should celebrate rather than criticise.
Yeah.
And he pointed out that in terms of breaking the law, they were no more guilty of that than the Europeans, who really dominated those industries, and the Chinese were just hoping for a fair go.
Right.
So
there's a fascinating High Court case, Ingham and He Li, which I really enjoyed reading about.
Yes.
Do you want to talk about that case?
Yes.
Yeah.
So He Li was a laundry owner who, as you'd expect, ran a laundry, and he was charged with breaking the law by allowing one of his employees to work in the evening, I think between 9 and 10 at night or something like that. And William took on this case and successfully argued that the so-called employee was actually a boarder, somebody who was just there as a lodger, as a boarder. And instead of working in the laundry late at night outside the permitted working hours, he was actually just ironing his own shirt.
Right.
And so then came to a discussion around how the legislation should be interpreted and whether work should be given a narrow construction or whether it should apply to somebody who was just ironing their own shirt late at night. And thankfully, and not surprisingly, the court came to the view that work should be given a narrow interpretation by reference to the work in a factory. And the court established a principle that still survives to this day, and that is that in interpreting a statute, the courts should be mindful of the consequences of an interpretation and what the Parliament may have intended. And that principle is still current law today. It's, if you look at Dennis Pearce statutory interpretation in Australia, the classic text, he cites Ingham and He Li for that purpose, that in interpreting legislation, the courts should have regard to the consequences of an interpretation and whether, in fact, that was what was intended. So, yes, very amusing and gives you an idea about the nature of the cases in which William had got involved.
How politicised did these cases become? Because, this is an era where particularly the trade union movement is very against the import of cheap Chinese labour, as they would have described it. And there's a lot of, quite racist speeches you can see in Hansard and, of course, in newspaper clippings of the era, where there is that sense that these cheap foreign labourers, Chinese labourers, are going to come in and flood Australia and undercut the Australian workers' wages, and we've got to keep them out and stop them ironing shirts at 9 o'clock at night or the like.
Yes, it really was, as is often the case, the fear of the unknown, the fear of the other that was behind the concerns around the yellow peril and all of the discriminatory and racist tropes that came up at that time. As I said, William was an example of somebody who really proved everyone who was discriminatory wrong, because he proved himself to be really the quintessential Australian in so many ways. In fact, I think he was more Australian than I am in many respects. So, yes, it does make you wonder what he was up against.
Did he get involved in politics? He was getting involved in community representation, and obviously was at one stage the acting consul general for China.
Yes.
So he's getting involved in the sort of diplomatic
Yes,
community.
He certainly got involved in that regard. In fact, he spent quite a bit of time early on trying to convince the government to allow China to establish a consulate in Melbourne. He'd also hosted visits by various officials from China to the colony of Victoria. And then after Federation, as you alluded to, he acted as the honorary consul general of China in, I think, 1912, 1913, and then again in 1917. So he worked hard to get China represented in Melbourne, in Victoria, but he tended, I think, to steer clear of a lot of the political issues of the time. He certainly worked hard against the discriminatory legislation. But in that sense, he was very much acting as an advocate, as a lawyer. I don't know to what extent he was minded to get more involved in politics. I think he may have thought to himself, well, the law's been a difficult nut to crack, politics would be even more difficult. And so he probably thought it would make sense for him to stay within his comfort zone, as it were, and not stick his head out too much. In fact, I refer to William as being an advocate, but not an activist in that sense.
Right, yeah.
He probably thought that he could work more effectively from within, and he was always very respectful and polite in his efforts to have the discriminatory legislation repealed, and his advocacy for the Chinese, and always very eloquent as well. If you read his writing, he was an incredibly eloquent person who knew how to use the English language and did so to great advantage in court. And I think that's what Menzies may have admired about him, his ability to use the English language.
What about his sense of Britishness? So this is an era when you were a British subject, you weren't an Australian citizen until 1948. So he was a British subject, and British identity just was the overwhelming sense of identity in Australia at the time. He felt part of that?
Yes, he did. It's obviously a complex question, identity and that sort of thing. I think he probably felt as British as one might have thought at the time. He certainly referred to Britishness in his advocacy for the Chinese, for them to be treated in the same way. He even pointed out in that pamphlet I mentioned before that the British at the time, they were treated very well in China because they had the foreign concessions and they enjoyed various privileges and benefits. And in that pamphlet, he said, all he is asking is that the Chinese Australians be given the same rights as other British subjects. And so that was a motivating force behind his struggle against the discriminatory legislation. I think he grew up Chinese culturally, but he was of a mixed culture to the extent that his wife was of European background. His children grew up very much as Australians and they spoke English in the family.
Did they speak Chinese? Did he speak to them in Chinese?
Not to my knowledge, no.
Right.
And whether that was a conscious decision on his part or not, or whether, as you would expect, William just felt more comfortable speaking English.
Yeah.
But whatever the reasons, he grew up in a very Australian family. They used to have holidays down on the Mornington Peninsula. They'd
go to the races.
They'd go to the races, Flemington. He did so many things that you'd expect
and he loved the theatre too, didn't he?
He loved the theatre, Gilbert and Sullivan, which he used to quote in his submissions to the bench. So yes, he did like Australian culture, although in terms of what they ate at home, every Friday evening he'd come home having been to the market with a fish, and he would then steam the fish according to the Chinese methodology and steam it with ginger and spring onions, and they'd have that with rice. And so that was really his time to celebrate his Chineseness, when on most of the other days I suspect it was much more the Britishness that featured in their lives.
What about his efforts to bridge the gap between East and West? And he explores this in a lecture he gives, I think, at the Morrison Lecture in 1933.
Yes. So as you may be aware, George Ernest Morrison came to be known as Morrison of Peking. Initially, he did medicine. He came up from Scotland and had studied medicine and practiced medicine for a few years before moving to China, where he was the Beijing correspondent for the Times. And he ended up spending, I think, 20 years in China, where he amassed this huge library of Chinese classics, how much of which he actually could read himself, I'm not sure. But he became quite a well-known character in China at the time, and he was considered to be one of the personalities, one of the well-known characters in Australia-China relations who had worked hard to bring the two countries together, if you like. Perhaps he was a bit of a William Ah Ket equivalent in Peking, as it was then called. But what William did in 1933 with another William Liu, who had been an assistant at the consulate, the Chinese consulate, but then subsequently went on to establish his own shipping company. William Ah Ket and William Liu established the G.E. Morrison lecture series, named after Morrison because of his pioneering work in China. But the purpose of that was very much to unite, to bring the two countries together, to overcome the differences. And would you believe that series has been going ever since?
Amazing.
And I think,
wow.
save for 1 or 2 years, perhaps during COVID, it's been run every year. It's administered by the Australian National University. And William gave the second G.E. Morrison lecture in which he talked about Chinese philosophy and the extent to which it crossed over with and overlapped with Christianity. And once again, this was an effort on William's part to prove that, after all, when everything's said and done, we are all humans and we're all much the same. And it's quite an interesting paper to read because William does reveal quite a bit about his own philosophy and the extent to which he himself crossed over between the East and the West, or the Orient and the Occident, as it was then called. And his basic point was that we're all the same. In fact, he made a comment that ended up in the headlines in the paper the following day, and that was that if Confucius had been alive at the time, he probably would have enjoyed listening to the bagpipes.
Yes, I read that. I wonder why he picked up on the bagpipes.
Good question. I suspect it was because of Gertrude and her Scottish background.
I see, of course. But perhaps there are some Chinese instruments that have a similar timbre to the bagpipe.
Well, yes. I'm
sort
thinking
of
in
haunting
particular.
kind of.
Yes. There's a Chinese instrument called the shawm, which has that sort of reedy sound to it. But yes, who knows? I think he was just doing his best to bring us together, reconcile. And his younger daughter, Toylaan, who wrote the book, as you mentioned, she highlights the extent to which William was all about unity, reconciliation, bridging the gap. And I think he was the embodiment of that.
In the, I think, 1912, 13, he visits China as a delegate of the Victorian Chinese Chamber of Commerce. As we said before, he's acting consul general for China in 1913, 14 and in 1917. Does he enjoy this aspect of his work or is he sort of first and foremost a lawyer and wants to sort of stick to the legal cases and advocacy?
I suspect the latter. He's not the first lawyer who's got involved in diplomacy. And in fact, interestingly enough, not the first Chinese lawyer to have got involved in diplomacy. There are examples in the US, for example, where prominent Chinese lawyers got involved in diplomacy and community affairs. I think deep down he was a lawyer, but his legal skills were a means towards achieving outcomes, good outcomes for the Chinese community. I don't think he was the type of person who actively sought publicity. I don't think he went out of his way to increase his profile. In fact, I think he was quite a modest person with a good sense of humour. And indeed, if you look at all the photos that were taken at the time, family photos, many of which appear in the book, in many of the photos, it's William behind the camera, which I think says a lot about his modesty. And he didn't want to be in the photo. He was much more comfortable being the photographer, as it were. So there are, of course, a lot of photos of William, but relatively few of William just being relaxed. So I think he probably avoided the limelight in many respects and may have been a bit of a reluctant celebrity, even though he was covered regularly in the press because of the novelty factor. And because he was such a skillful advocate, there's another case that I thought I'd mention, which involved a club owner who had been charged with operating or allowing a gambling machine to be operated in the club without a licence. And it was one of those fruit machines. And so William was instructed to defend him. And the question was whether this fruit machine was a game of skill or a game of chance, because if it were a game of chance, then it would be in breach of the gaming legislation and would have required a licence. William tried to argue that it was a game of skill, and he had the benefit of a consultant's report to the effect that if you knew how to handle the machine appropriately, you could win every time.
Oh.
And so what William arranged was for the fruit machine to be brought into the court. And William then deftly handled the machine in such a way that he said he'd get a cherry, and he ended up getting a cherry.
Right.
You see.
So did he win the case?
Well, no, because the judge, I think his name was Judge Foster at the time, wasn't convinced and asked him to repeat the trick. And when William repeated the trick, it didn't work.
Oh, I didn't get the cherry.
So the court held that it was actually a game of chance, and the person was convicted accordingly.
Right. Is there a sense, though, that William's role as a representative of China in that early 20th century might have influenced, given he was so erudite, came across as quite British, assimilated, that he might have influenced the views of people like Menzies and John Latham on China?
It's difficult to imagine that he wouldn't have. And the question then arises, well, how might he have influenced them? I know at the time, Georgina, there were concerns about social cohesion. However critical you might be about the white Australian policy, it was motivated by concerns about conflict and about social problems, many of which had occurred in other countries.
Yeah.
So I'd like to think, you mentioned before Menzies' role in trying to achieve a cohesive Australia. I'd like to think that William was really the ideal Australian. And as I said, he proved so many people wrong in terms of becoming the quintessential Australian, despite his background, despite the colour of his skin. And so one would hope that he had a positive influence on the development of policy in Australia and the thinking of people like Menzies, and that ultimately the system followed its natural course and we did away with the White Australia policy. We're still having the argument today, of course, about what multiculturalism is. It's a bit sad, I think, that during William's day, particularly in the early 20th century, really the only way in which William could integrate was to highlight the similarities and downplay the differences. It was almost as though, just as we say that somebody is guilty unless proven innocent, he was, if you like, different until proven similar.
Yeah.
So he did whatever he could to highlight how similar the similarities between the Chinese and the Europeans. And I think he did so to great effect. And I think, as I said, he was the embodiment of that crossover and a very early example of the benefits, if you like, of multiculturalism and diversity.
He never does get to the bench, though.
No.
I think Menzies, in the Measure of the Years, said that he would have been a very competent judge had he been appointed to the bench, but that he was a phenomenon at the bar. His legacy, though, does live on today. Of course, there's the William Ah Ket Scholarship that it was established by the Asian Australian Lawyers Association 9 years ago. But I was very interested to read that one of his descendants is the guitarist John Williams.
Absolutely.
Now, that's pretty cool.
No, it's quite remarkable
Yeah.
when you think that we wouldn't have John Williams without William Ah Ket. Now, John Williams is not to be confused with the American composer of Star Wars fame.
Yeah, sure.
But John was the son of William's elder daughter, Maylan, who married Len Williams, who was the guitarist. And they had John, who then subsequently went on to become one of history's greatest classical guitarists. And yes, it's just an example of what impact William has had on Australia and culture. And it's quite remarkable. I remember I was once doing some research on William Ah Ket on a Saturday afternoon and I had the radio going, ABC FM, and a recording by John Williams came on. And I just sat there thinking, isn't this remarkable?
It is.
I'm here studying, researching William Ah Ket, and at the same time I'm listening to his grandson. Another person who's quite well known, at least to those in this area, is Rupert Hing, who was the son of William's eldest sister, Matilda. So Rupert Hing was an industrial artist, designer, and it was he who designed the logo for the Redhead Ladies matchboxes. So, yes, and there are others who've made an enormous contribution to Australia. His other grandson, John Williams's contemporary, Paul Ket, was an inventor of some repute. In fact, he invented the Tassaloto ball machine.
Oh, there you go.
Would you believe?
Oh, maybe that's a legacy of that fruit machine, the game of
Absolutely.
chance.
Who knows?
That's surely a game of chance.
But of course, with 5 sisters who then went on to have children and so on, that the descendants do get around and are represented in quite big numbers.
Well, Andrew Godwin, this has been a wonderful discussion about William Ah Ket, such an important Australian. And it's great that this book by his daughter, who has sadly died, but it has been published, William Ah Ket, His Life and Times. So thank you so much for your time today.
My pleasure, Georgina.
History matters because ideas matter. Thank you for listening to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. To follow more of our work, subscribe to the podcast and visit robertmenziesinstitute.org.au. I'm Georgina Downer. Until next time.